Very special thanks to My Next Car in Bedfordshire for providing the vehicle in this review. They're a family-run dealership, and I thoroughly enjoyed working with them. And if you check out the link down below in the description to their website, they've got a pretty nice inventory. So if you're in the market for a car in Bedfordshire, check them out down below. The single biggest reason why I wanted to review this particular Mercedes, which could seem a little odd and out of nowhere as far as car reviews go, is somewhat linked to my own choice of car. Because for those of you who know me and have been around on the channel for a while, you'll know that I drive a Touareg V10 from Volkswagen, a direct competitor with this car, along with a couple of other choices such as the Porsche Cayenne and the Range Rover Sport of that time. And that's the reason why I wanted to review this car. Car, of course, in a general sense, the Mercedes ML55 AMG. Because, from what I've seen and heard and read, a lot of potential buyers seem to overlook this one. You see, at least here in the UK, Range Rover Sports all over the place. There are tons of Cayennes, even the 4.5 V8S, which I've also driven, and you do see a decent mix of Touaregs. Some of the V8s, occasionally the V10s, and the prices vary quite wildly depending on the condition. This ML55, on the other hand, is much more of a unicorn. They don't pop up that often, you don't see them around that often, and because it's such a sleeper, which is surprising for an AMG, you don't really notice them even when you do see one, because apart from the changed front bumper, it doesn't even look that much different to a normal ML. Now, of course, the trained eye will notice it, but most people won't. And because of the fact that this generation of ML seems kind of forgotten to time for many people anyway, it's not as obvious of a choice. And that's why I wanted to talk about it, because I believe that even though the Touareg is still by far my favourite of this era of sports SUVs, and I'm certainly happy that I decided to buy that of these options, there is a lot to love about this Mercedes, especially if you're in the market for a Porsche Cayenne. If you are more on the Porsche side of things than the Touareg side, in terms of which one you like the idea of, then you definitely need to listen to this review, because the Mercedes is a fantastic alternative to a Cayenne. They have a lot in common, in fact much more so than the Volkswagen, and of course we're going to get into some of those reasons and similarities in this review. So, first things first, why am I saying that it is a great rival to the Cayenne? Well, first of all, of course, it's a petrol. The Touareg's a diesel, so it's much more of a direct rivalry and a direct comparison when you're looking at the Mercedes V8 versus the Porsche V8. A couple of things are also in common between them. Beyond being a V8, they're both, interestingly, naturally aspirated. No turbo, no supercharger. That surprised me when it came to this Mercedes, because usually this Daimler Chrysler era of AMGs has compressor written down the side. It was a very popular thing. Even some of the Mercs that I've reviewed in the past had that, of course. This one, curiously, didn't opt to do that. It's a naturally aspirated 5.4 litre V8. That's a beefy engine, bigger than the Touareg V10 and the Porsche, way bigger than the Porsche, in fact almost a full litre bigger. And interestingly, it's also the most powerful of the three. The Touareg has 307 horsepower, the Cayenne has 340, this has 350. That's pretty healthy. Where things get really spicy though, is the torque. Because of course, it wouldn't even be fair to compare the Mercedes or the Porsche to my car, because the diesel torque with the twin turbo just trumps them both, 553 pound-feet stock. However, the Mercedes is significantly torquier than the Porsche. And although often stuff like horsepower and torque doesn't seem to matter that much in the real world, actually it does, especially torque. Torque is something which you'll use on a daily basis regardless of if you're hooning the car around through corners. Torque is what allows you to have better fuel economy, easier driving, less wear and tear on the engine, you don't have to work the engine as hard, and even, of course, the obvious choice of towing things becomes easier when you have a torquier engine. So with that in mind, the Mercedes has way more torque than the Porsche. The Porsche has 310 pound-feet to the Merc's 380, so it's not even close. Now curiously, of these three cars, the three main rivals of the V-Dub, the Porker, and the Merc, The Merc is the only one of the three with a 5-speed gearbox. All three are automatic of course, but both my car and the Porsche are a 6-speed, the Mercedes is a 5. But that was a pretty popular thing for them back then. Even the SLR McLaren had a 5-speed as well. In terms of stuff like practicality, how does it compare there? Because of course that is one of the biggest things on a daily basis that you're going to want to know and use. Well, in terms of exterior proportions, it's interesting. The Mercedes is very tall, but it's not overly long and it's not overly wide. My Touareg is a very wide car. The Cayenne is more length where you notice it. It's not that wide, not that tall, but it's fairly long. The Mercedes is the taller of the three, or at least that's the way it looks when you're standing next to it, and the headroom, I will say, is very good. In fact, it's pretty good in all three, not surprisingly. The Mercedes, though, has very, very good width room. And one of the reasons why is because the Touareg is so chunky in terms of interior design, which in my opinion makes it age better. There's no creaking, everything looks better by today's standards. What I will say for the Mercedes though is, if you look at pictures of this car's interior online, you might dislike it. As many of you know, I'm a big guy when it comes to interior love. I think it's a very important thing. But the Mercedes looks a lot better in person. I will give it that. It's far classier than the photos make it appear, at least in a spec such as this one. The Porsche, as I've said before, I'm not a fan of that car's interior at all. It feels actually surprisingly bad for a car with a Porsche badge on the front, very plasticky, creaky, under par for what I'd expect. The Mercedes is definitely better than that. It is more spacious than the Porsche. As you could see from the interior shots with the doors and the boot open, it's got tons of trunk space, and something which I had no idea about, and I'm assuming it was an optional extra, is that the Mercedes actually has 7 seats. There's 2 extra which can come up in the back. The Touareg and the Porsche don't have that, as far as I'm aware. You might be able to get some kind of retro kit fitted to it, but the Mercedes has that for sure, and that's an interesting advantage. What about in terms of the way it drives though? Well, that is where I'm going to have to give it a little bit of a demerit, because of the 3 cars, the Mercedes definitely has the strangest steering. Now, of course, I can't say whether it was just the car that I drove or if this applies to all ML55s, but it was strangely light through corners. And even in a straight line, the steering wheel moves around so easily, you can basically drive this car with your fingertips, which sounds like a good thing, but it feels very weird when you first start driving it in particular. Now, of course, you could say it's because you're used to the Touareg. The Touareg is far heavier, 2.7 tons. This car's 2.3, massive difference. Of course, the Touareg is more understeery. It's kind of known for that. But even so, the Porsche Cayenne is very good through corners as well, possibly the best of the 3, technically speaking. The Mercedes just feels a little bit odd to me. What I will say is the lightness of the steering allows it to be very playful. You can definitely get the ML55 through corners in a borderline sports car fashion from that kind of time. It definitely takes some getting used to though, and again, I can't speak to whether that's all of them or just this car, but I'm assuming that that's probably an ML55 trait in general. Definitely takes some getting used to, I will say that. What about in terms of running costs? Well, in some ways it's not too bad. The tax on this one, for instance, here in the UK is significantly cheaper than my Volkswagen. Despite the fact that the Merc has a way bigger engine, way more power, and is faster, it's still cheaper to tax because the emissions are lower, with it being a petrol compared to my diesel. In fact, it's a lot cheaper. I pay £570 a year on my car. This one, on the other hand, it's about £330, which is more comparable to the Porsche. So again, great rivals match between the Cayenne and the ML55. In terms of performance, just before we get to fuel economy, the Mercedes is, factually speaking, the fastest of the 3, by a significant margin, about a second quicker to 60 than the Touareg, and about 0.3, 0.4 quicker than the Cayenne. So definitively quicker, in other words. So if you're looking for the pure performance factor, well, the Mercedes might well be the SUV for you. In terms of running costs on fuel though, it's not great. However, it's also relative. The reason why I say it's not great is because of the one that I drive. If you compare the fuel economy on the Mercedes to a Porsche Cayenne, well, there's actually not much between them. Both of them get about 19 miles per gallon at best, drops to around 12 to 14 around town, which is pretty horrendous, let's be honest. And the reason why I say it's horrendous is because my Touareg with the remapped engine does 36 miles per gallon on the highway. So of course I'm going to look down on these SUVs because it's not even close. Between the Porsche and the Merc though, they rival each other pretty well, and if you have to have a petrol, well, of course it doesn't matter too much on the miles per gallon front between them. Now, of course, since I don't own this car and it's not a long-term test, I can't speak definitively on the point of what repair costs are, servicing costs, or even general reliability. I can, however, say to you that don't always believe what people tell you. So many people warned me about the Touareg V10. I've owned it for a year now and I've had no engine issues whatsoever. And it's a 6-figure mileage car. So take all of those with a pinch of salt. However, of course, it is an AMG from the earlier 2000s, so take that as you will. Be prepared for costs, potentially. But as I always say, that is the calculated risk that you have to take if it's the car for you. My ultimate verdict when it comes to the ML55 is that this is very specifically the choice for somebody who wants an SUV for a great price from this era, but actually wants to get the factual fastest option. Because this one is faster than the Range Rover Sport, it's faster than the Cayenne V8S, and it's faster than the Touareg V10. So for pure performance and bragging rights, the Mercedes is the choice for you. The points where it's not as great are it's a little bit soft and wallowy through corners, as I said, a little bit shallow on the steering, which takes some getting used to, and in my opinion, it kind of looks its age more than the other cars do, but that's mostly down to personal opinion, so you need to decide that for yourself. So ultimately, of course, if you do get the chance to test drive one, definitely try and do so. I would say the same thing about the Cayenne and obviously the Touareg V10 if you are in the market. Those are the three main rivals. Give them all a look. See which one you like the most. The Mercedes, though, is a very interesting option, and it is something of a unicorn in the SUV world. Overall, though, that's it for my thoughts on the ML55. Of course, if you're new to the channel, check out my other reviews for the Touareg V10, for instance, of course, the C32 AMG that I mentioned, and others too. And until next time, I'll see you then. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.